One of the major advantages of being an indie developer the past decade has been being able to think outside the box when it comes to new designs or taking previously established genres in new directions. Be it with the extension of what is a roguelike or roguelite, to deck builders, to new kinds of platformers, puzzle games, and so on. But understanding when to break the mold and when to use it is a very important skill, especially if you are trying to pitch a game to a wider audience. And that's going to be our topic for today's show. One of the challenges of the market today, especially for indie developers, is knowing when to break the mold and do something differently, or to use established genre trends and norms when it comes to appealing to a wide audience. And as we've said in many of our previous design videos here, that you can't assume that your game is going to be niche. And what I mean by that is purposely not thinking about UI UX and not really thinking about how this game is going to be viewed beyond just you, your friends, and maybe your super hardcore fan base. And as a developer, it's important to look at when you are establishing a new game or working in a genre and doing something differently, what aspects you need to keep and what aspects you can mess around with. There's something that we've said about, in order to be able to kind of think outside the box or break the rules, you need to know the rules previously. And one of the things that we've seen from developers in the past few years has been this challenge of juggling established norms and trends with doing something differently. One of the major examples, of course, is the deck building roguelite, just massive subgenre. Massive subgenre could be safely extreme there. But people who have been developing these kinds of deck builders have been all kind of trying to either borrow a page from Slay the Spire, or doing everything they can not to be Slay the Spire. And you can definitely see this with the sheer number that we've played from Monster Train, Inscription, Library of Ruin, and again, there are just so many of them, my mind is kind of blanking. Because I even have a few, like 3 or 4 demos of deck building roguelites installed for a later stream. And when we look at developers who are trying to experiment in this space, you have to understand that there is always a foundational element, no matter what genre you're working in, no matter what your intended market may be. And the established elements, this is what we talk about when we discuss kind of the foundational or building block elements of design. And again, each genre has its own rule set. This is why when we play a platformer, we expect the A button or the space bar in order to jump. We don't expect a F11 or a screen lock or scroll lock to hit B, the jump button. Likewise, when we talk about first person or third person shooting, why we use these triggers for shooting as opposed to pressing R3. And when you are a developer looking at working in a new genre or looking at aspects to break, you do not want to mess with foundational stuff. Because the foundational or your core gameplay loop mechanics, these are the elements that, one, it's what the market and the audience is expecting, and two, this is the stuff that you want to make sure that you get right. And there is oftentimes a very big difference between a developer who is not accustomed to a genre, working in that space for the first time and just completely doing whatever they want, and somebody who is established or has understood the genre and is purposely doing things differently because they know what these tropes are, they know what aspects they can hold and which ones they can break. And this is a very important skill as a developer, that when you are trying to do something experimental, it still has to come from a place of being recognizable. Because if you have no familiarity whatsoever in your game, it's going to be very hard to get people interested in playing it. Now again, somebody like me, when I do my indie showcases, I take all kinds of games, I don't care. Send everyone my way. But if you're trying to convince a consumer, somebody who is going to be spending money on your game, and they have no idea what your game is or how it's played or even just what it is, like even just from a genre point of view, from a screenshot, that is not good. And this is why, from a development standpoint, you have to study and do research on a genre that you want to work in. Whether it's a platformer, visual novel, RPG, roguelike, racing, stealth, whatever. Because this is where you start to build up the fundamental knowledge of what that genre is, what works in it, what doesn't work in it. Because you need to have that if you want to then do something different. And when we say do something different, again, this is as far as your imagination can go. Do you want to build a roguelike cooking sim, spaceship cleaning, a platformer FPS murder mystery? Whatever the heck that you want to do. But if you're going to go out in a different direction, and that's, again, something that we've seen a lot of developers do over the past 5 to 6 years, there still has to be some kind of anchor point. Something that people can load up your game and go, okay, I can see that these are platformer controls, or I can see that this is a first-person perspective, or isometric. And this is, again, where you can start to build your experience from. Now, we've talked many times about mixing genre elements or genre systems together, and we're going to talk about that a little bit more in this next part. But before we move on, when you are researching a game or researching a genre to see what works and what doesn't, you should be exposing yourself to as wide of a spectrum as you can. You want to look at all the amazing games, you want to look at all the bad games, and you want to look at the ones that are kind of in the middle, the flawed gems. Because there is always something that you can learn from games that did not do as well as anyone would have hoped. There could be some kind of missed element, whether it's from an aesthetic point of view, how the controls are, or even just how these systems work. Because there are certain cases where no matter how great the developers are, how much they put time and money and effort into it, maybe these systems just aren't meant to be together. Like trying to fit a gambling gacha system into a hardcore Dark Souls that's also a space sim. And this is why when you look at games that try to combine multiple systems from different genres, they can oftentimes end up being lesser than the sum of their parts if something just doesn't fit right, or if one part of the experience is not meshing with the rest of it. It's why one of the things that I talked about when I interviewed Ernest Adams from like 5-6 years ago about this concept of harmonizing game design, where every aspect of the game is working in unison. And this is what we often see from master level games, or the games that go on to be the best of each respective year. That it can have all these different and random, or supposedly random elements in them, but it's done in a way that it all connects. And getting to that point of where you can have 3-4 different gameplay loops working in harmony together, that's a bit of a challenge. So we're going to discuss that after this quick break, and as always, if you're interested in my thoughts on design, then check out my latest offering of books. For entry-level students, we have 20 essential games to study, and then the Game Design Deep Dive series that takes an extensive look at different genres, with free-to-play coming in 2022. So as we said in the last part, once you kind of have your foundational elements set, once you know what are the main or core gameplay loop elements that must be in your game from a UI UX perspective, the question then turns to, how do we break this? How do we do something different while still retaining that initial audience and fan base? And the short answer to that is that you really can't do that perfectly. Whenever you introduce mechanics or systems from another genre, be it platforming, racing, puzzle, cooking, stealth, driving, whatever, you are creating kind of a divergence in that gameplay loop. And that means that for every different system in your game, you're going to be kind of splitting that fan base between those who are willing to accept those elements or who may like them, and those that have or they don't want any part of it. If I'm pitching this game as a first-person shooter, and then, halfway through it turns into a side-scroller or isometric stealth game, that is certainly different and unique. But there may, or I'm sure there are a lot of first-person shooter fans who don't want that particular style of game. And this is one of the reasons why when we talk about doing multiple genres or mixing systems from different games, this is definitely high level or a very, expert level design. That you do not want to be mixing things haphazardly. And every time you do these mixes, you are going to be diluting whatever your core gameplay loop is. Now, as you're combining elements, you want to be looking at ways of having some kind of synergy between them. In an example from Nightmare Reaper, the game features 3 different subsystems that involve 2D platforming, side-scrolling shoot-'em-ups, and Pokemon, all on top of being a hardcore, reflex-driven arcade shooter. Now, those additional systems provide rewards and stuff that enhances the first-person shooting aspect. Doing the first-person shooting gives you money and resources that you can use to then get further in those additional modes, and we have this circular loop of how these systems are integrated. Xcom is another really big example of this. You go into the geoscape level to find bases or alien encounters. You go fight those aliens. You get those resources to bring back to your base. You get upgrades and new stuff, which you can then use back on the geoscape and then back on the alien encounters. You do not want to have something in your game just because. So that would be having a system like, let's say, just having crafting, but there's never a need to craft because all your resources are just automatically used when you pick them up. You don't want to put something in your game just because it was featured in another genre. And this can be very tricky, especially if we're talking again about stuff that may be considered instrumental or foundational to that core gameplay loop. As a good case in point would be survival elements. If you've looked at the survival sim or survival crafter genre over the past decade with stuff like 7 Days to Die, Rust, The Long Dark, Subnautica, and many, many more, there's always this split on, do we need to have survival elements? You can die of hunger or thirst or running out of oxygen. Or do we take that stuff out of the equation? Some games will say no, that you can take that stuff out and no harm, no foul. Others will keep them in, and some will kind of meet halfway and have modes to turn them on or off based on what you want. And this is, again, entirely going to be up to you as a developer. But you don't want to put them in just because everyone says yes, that all this stuff should be in your game. Because again, if you're doing things differently, you don't want to fall back on these elements because they may not work with the new systems. We played a deck building roguelike. I think this was, I cannot remember the name of it off the top of my head. This one was done by, I think, previous Magic the Gathering developers. And this was, again, a game that had very much clear-cut elements from Slay the Spire. Again, if you say deck building roguelike, most likely you're going to be hitting Slay the Spire elements. But it did do things differently with having different partners and swapping between the front row and the back row. Now, did the game succeed perfectly on all fronts? We could argue no. But what the game did specifically was, again, it knew what elements it needed to take from this formula. Deck building, organizing cards, upgrades, artifacts, fighting enemies. But it also knew what areas that there was a sense of malleability to it, being able to explore on the map, having persistent upgrades. And again, did all these elements work perfectly? We can certainly argue that. But it's not a case of the developer just putting the stuff in just to have it in. And this is again why you want to do research on these genres. During the heyday of Blizzard, the late 90s into the 2000s, that Blizzard has been credited at that time as one of the most analytical game studios in the world, that they could look at a genre and take it apart to understand what elements worked, which elements didn't work, and then what they can add on top of that to make it their own. And again, this takes a lot of understanding design and analyzing game systems. And it's not easy to do, as I've said in other videos. But if you can get to this point, that you understand a genre fully inside and out, you can then start to take elements away and replace them with something else. And again, one of the hardest aspects about this is when it comes to the UI. Because whenever you have completely different systems working together, it can be hard to create one unified UI that explains each and every system. And it's why there's been a lot of work and studies on improving the UI and UX of a title, so that we can have different gameplay systems that can either operate under a single UI or only having maybe one or two main UI screens. And again, this is very difficult to break down or to be able to do right. Now, to begin to wrap things up, when you are experimenting, do not be afraid to throw out elements. This was something that I spoke with Chris Park about on a number of occasions, as he was coming up with new expansions or trying to build systems on top of systems for games like The Last Federation, AI Wars 2, A Valley Without Wind, and so on. Everything must always stem from your core gameplay loop. If a system may be cool and may be awesome, but is completely clashing with the gameplay loop that you originally set, you have two options. You either completely change your game to accommodate that, or you throw out that system. And there is no shame in removing gameplay systems that you just cannot get to work. At the end of the day, it's better to have one cohesive game than a game made up of 3, 4, 5 different systems that just don't feel like they're working in unison together. And as we've said in previous talks as well about kind of how the market has changed, people these days don't want 300, 400, 500 plus hour slogs of how many different gameplay systems and how many, hours of grinding we can put in these games. It is better to have a short and highly polished experience, one that someone can walk away from your game and say that they enjoyed it. Because that's how you get people to be interested in your next title and your next one after that. And another good example of a studio to look at in terms of doing things different or combine these different aspects would be somebody like Clay Entertainment, who have done very different games between Don't Starve, Hot Lava, Invisible Ink, Auction Not Included, Grifflands, and I'm sure whatever the next game there is they're working on. And like I said, don't be afraid to experiment. If you are in the prototype or you're just working on this on your side job or part-time, don't be afraid to do crazy things with these designs. Because again, you never know when something is going to resonate. When we have the next Stardew Valley, or Forager, or even something like Vampire Survivors. But again, being able to break something requires intimate knowledge of how that thing works to begin with. Because if you just keep throwing mechanics and systems at the wall and hoping that you'll stumble upon the next Among Us, that is not going to happen. And you may end up with a game that is just a complete mess of systems that there could be some gem or diamond in the rough here, but it's going to be very hard to get to it, and most people may end up quitting before they even see the genius that's there. So, to wrap things up, or to end our video, can you think of games that just, the island of misfit toys or Frankenstein's monster of mechanics and systems? And did it work out well for you? Did all these different elements that look like they shouldn't work, that they couldn't work, still came together in a great way? Let me know in the comments below, and as always, do the liking, subscribing, and additional commenting that YouTube demands of you. Check out our Discord and Patreon link down below, and come back for daily discussions on game design here and on game wisdom, where you some of the art and science of games.